Welcome back to Narrative Wisdom Hub channel. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you tuning in from today? Drop your country in the comments below. If you love jaw-dropping stories of billionaires going undercover, secret investigations, and shocking workplace revelations, then you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible story. Now, let's dive into today's story, where a powerful CEO goes undercover on his own airline, only to discover a truth that shakes him to his core. The private office on the top floor of Sunset Sky's headquarters in Los Angeles was immaculate. Glass walls, leather furniture, and a breathtaking view of the city skyline. It was the kind of office most people dream of, but for Ethan Drake, the billionaire founder of one of America's fastest-growing airlines, it had started to feel like a cage. His assistant had just left a neatly arranged stack of reports on his desk: earnings, customer satisfaction scores, and employee performance reviews, all glowing. Yet something gnawed at him. For months, whispers had reached him: anonymous complaints, murmurs of dissatisfaction, rumors of a toxic work culture among his cabin crew. His senior managers assured him everything was fine. Nothing but a few disgruntled employees, they told him. But Ethan wasn't convinced. He had built Sunset Skies from the ground up with a vision of excellence. He had handpicked executives, designed first-class luxury experiences, and ensured top-tier service. And yet, there was a growing disconnect between the numbers on the reports and the reality he suspected lurked beneath the surface. There was only one way to find out the truth. 2 days later, Ethan Drake arrived at Los Angeles International Airport, not in his usual tailored suit, but in a casual hoodie, jeans, and a pair of worn-out sneakers. He had shaved his signature neatly trimmed beard and swapped his sleek haircut for a messy, tousled look. His name on the first-class ticket: Adam Cole. He was going undercover. As he moved through the terminal, he marveled at how different the experience was when he wasn't being escorted through VIP lounges or ushered past security. He watched employees more closely, noting their expressions, their energy, or lack thereof. When he finally boarded Flight SS-217 to New York, he slid into his plush first-class seat, tucked in the corner, hidden beneath the dim cabin lighting. The airline's signature golden crest gleamed on the uniforms of the flight attendants bustling around, preparing for takeoff. That's when he heard them. 2 flight attendants stood near the galley, just a few feet away from his seat, speaking in hushed but frustrated tones. "I swear if I have to hear one more speech about company values, I'm going to lose it," said the first attendant, a woman with sharp green eyes and a clipped tone. Her name tag read Harriet. The other, a younger woman named Talia, snorted. "Right? As if Ethan Drake actually cares about us. Have you ever even seen him in person? He sits up there in his glass tower making decisions that ruin our lives, and we're supposed to smile and pretend everything is great?" Ethan's pulse quickened. He leaned back slightly, trying to appear employees did. For the first time in his life, he felt like a stranger in his own company. And that's just the beginning. What will Ethan do next? Will he stay silent and keep observing, or will he confront the truth head-on? Stay tuned, because this story is only getting started. What do you think so far? Have you ever worked at a job where management seemed completely out of touch? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next part of this unbelievable journey. The hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin, a steady, rhythmic noise that should have been soothing. But Ethan Drake felt anything but relaxed. He sat motionless in his seat, hands clasped together, staring blankly at the untouched glass of champagne on his tray table. He could still hear them, Harriet and Talia, their voices slicing through the polished illusion of his airline like a knife. "I used to love this job," Now I just tolerate it. He sits in his glass tower making decisions that ruin our lives. Each word was like a stone dropping into a deep, dark well inside him. They weren't just criticizing their jobs. They were criticizing him. For the first time in years, Ethan questioned himself. Had he really been so blind? Had he been so caught up in stock prices, expansion plans, and industry awards that he'd stopped seeing the people who actually kept sunset skies in the air? He wanted to believe the reports his executives gave him. He wanted to believe that this was just bitterness from a few disgruntled employees, but deep down, he knew better. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. Ignoring this wasn't an option anymore, but what was the next move? Just as Ethan was lost in thought, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me." Heads turned. A first-class passenger, a middle-aged man in an expensive tailored suit, was waving his empty champagne glass in the air like a king summoning his servants. "I asked for a refill 15 minutes ago. Are we running a budget airline now?" he snapped, looking directly at Harriet. Ethan's gaze darted toward her. She was frozen for just a second, just long enough for him to see it. The frustration, the exhaustion, the years of forced patience. But then, just like that, her mask was back on. Harriet flashed a tight, professional smile. "Apologies, sir. I'll bring that for you right away." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. I don't know what's happening to this airline. Service used to be better." Harriet turned toward the galley, but not before Ethan caught the tiniest flicker of irritation in her eyes. Talia muttered under her breath, "We should get hazard pay for dealing with these people." Harriet stifled a chuckle as she grabbed the champagne bottle. She was used to this, and that was what disturbed Ethan the most, the way she swallowed the insult without hesitation, because she had been trained to, because she had no choice, because she knew management wouldn't back her up. His fingers curled into a fist. This wasn't about one entitled passenger. This was about a system that forced employees to accept abuse as part of the job. And he had built that system. Ethan's pulse was still racing when he noticed something else. Harriet was pouring the champagne, but her eyes kept flicking back toward him. Then she leaned toward Talia and whispered something. Talia's brows lifted. Ethan's stomach twisted. Were they suspicious of him? Of course they wouldn't immediately assume he was Ethan Drake, CEO of Sunset Skies Airlines. But maybe he looked familiar. He had been featured in enough business magazines, enough investor interviews, that even a casual glance might spark recognition. For a brief, terrifying moment, he considered getting up, revealing himself and saying, "You're right. Everything you just said about me is right." But that wasn't how this needed to play out. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to listen, to learn. So he made a split-second decision. When Harriet finally approached, glass of champagne in hand, Ethan slumped deeper into his seat, lowering his gaze, making himself smaller. For the first time in his life, he made an effort to be invisible. "Here you are, sir," Harriet said politely, placing the flute on his tray. Ethan didn't look up. "Thanks," he muttered, deliberately keeping his voice low. There was a pause, just long enough for him to feel the weight of her gaze lingering. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. As the flight neared its descent into New York, Ethan's mind was racing. One flight wasn't enough. He had learned a lot, but it wasn't the full picture. He needed to see more, hear more, understand the depth of the problem. So before he even stepped off the plane, he booked another ticket. Same airline, different crew. And this time he wasn't just going to listen. This time, he was going to test his employees himself. Ethan didn't sleep that night. After stepping off flight SS-217 in New York, he headed straight to a hotel. But rest was impossible. His mind was still trapped in that first-class cabin, replaying every word Harriet and Talia had said. The anger, the exhaustion, the truth. The reports from his executives had been lies, or at the very least, heavily sanitized versions of reality. If 2 employees felt this way, how many more did? He needed more evidence. He needed to go deeper. So, without hesitation, Ethan booked himself another flight. This time, a longer one, coast to coast, New York to San Francisco. And this time, he wouldn't just listen. He would test his own system. Dressed once again in his casual disguise, Ethan boarded flight SS-345. The plane was larger, the crew different, but the energy? Exactly the same. The forced smiles, the exhaustion behind the eyes, the subtle, almost invisible signs of burnout. As he settled into his first-class seat, he decided to push the limits. He hit the call button. Moments later, a flight attendant appeared, a woman in her early 40s, her name tag reading Angela. "How can I assist you, sir?" she asked, her voice polite but mechanical. Ethan glanced at the menu. "I know it's not listed, but can I get a hot chamomile tea? Helps me sleep." Angela blinked, just barely concealing her surprise. "I'm not sure if we have that," she admitted, "but let me check for you." She disappeared toward the galley. Ethan watched closely. Moments later, she returned, empty-handed. "I'm sorry, sir. We don't carry chamomile tea in first class, but I do have green or black tea available." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temple like he was irritated. "Really? Chamomile is such a common tea. I swear every other airline has it." Angela stiffened slightly. "I'm truly sorry, sir," she repeated. "I can offer honey with your green tea if you'd like." Ethan nodded slowly, watching her closely. "Sure, green tea with honey is fine." Angela walked away, and that's when Ethan saw it. The smallest drop in her shoulders, as if the weight of another small failure had just added to a mountain of them. She knew it wasn't her fault, but she also knew she'd probably get blamed anyway. That was the problem, wasn't it? Sunset skies promised luxury, but if something was missing or went wrong, it was the employees, not the system, who suffered for it. Ethan had never seen it before, but now it was everywhere. 30 minutes into the flight, Ethan got his second test, without even planning for it. A man 2 rows ahead of him was complaining loudly. "Excuse me," he barked, waving over a young male flight attendant. His name tag read Jason. Jason hurried over, his face nervous but professional. "Yes, sir, how can I assist you?" The man jabbed a finger at his meal tray. "This steak is overcooked. I ordered medium rare, and this is basically well done. Do I look like someone who eats leather?" Jason hesitated. Ethan saw the problem immediately. The man had eaten half the steak already. Jason opened his mouth, probably about to say the obvious, that it was too late for a replacement since the food was already half gone, but instead he swallowed his response and said, "I'm very sorry about that, sir. Would you like me to see if we have another available?" The man scoffed. "I don't want another available steak. I want the steak I ordered." Jason hesitated again. He was stuck. Ethan felt his blood pressure rise. This wasn't about a steak. This was about power. The passenger knew he could push the limits. He knew that Jason, just like Harriet, just like Angela, would have no choice but to take it. Because the customer was always right. Because no manager would step in to defend him. Because Ethan had built a company where employees had to swallow their pride, no matter how unfair it was. Ethan had heard enough. Slowly he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. Jason noticed Ethan approaching and immediately tensed. "Sir, is there anything I can do for you?" Jason asked, already prepared to be scolded. Ethan ignored him for a moment and looked at the complaining passenger. "I couldn't help but overhear," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm. "You're unhappy with the steak?" The man crossed his arms. "Yeah, problem?" Ethan smiled slightly. "No problem at all. I just found it interesting that you ate half of it before deciding it was unacceptable." A flicker of annoyance crossed the man's face. "What are you, the food police?" Ethan shrugged. "No, but I do own a few restaurants." That part wasn't a lie. He had investments in several high-end chains. "And in my experience," Ethan continued, "when someone eats half their meal before complaining, it's usually not about the food. It's about seeing how much they can get away with." Silence. Jason's eyes widened slightly. The first-class cabin was watching now. The man's jaw clenched. "Are you accusing me of something?" Ethan just smiled, slow and deliberate. "Not at all. I'm just saying Jason here is doing his job, and he doesn't get paid enough to deal with nonsense." Jason visibly flinched at Ethan saying his name. The man glared at Ethan for a few more seconds, then huffed, "Forget it. Just take the damn tray away." Jason hurried to clear it, still shaken. Ethan sat back down, exhaling slowly. He hadn't planned to step in. He had wanted to just observe. But after what he had seen, he couldn't just sit back anymore. Jason came over a few minutes later, his voice hesitant. "Sir, I just wanted to say thanks for that. He swallowed. "Not a lot of people do that for us." Ethan felt a lump in his throat, because he knew the truth. Jason wouldn't be thanking him if Ethan had done his job as CEO properly in the first place. The plane had landed. The passengers were already disembarking, but Ethan Drake was still sitting in his first-class seat, staring at the floor. His mind was a whirlwind. For 2 flights, he had seen the cracks in his airline firsthand. The exhaustion, the injustice, the employees forced to endure mistreatment in silence. And he had tried to stay hidden, to keep observing. But he had slipped up, because as he stood to grab his bag, Jason was still watching him. "Sir," Jason hesitated. "I just wanted to thank you again. You didn't have to step in back there, but that meant a lot." Ethan nodded, forcing a small smile. "People should speak up when things aren't right." Jason exhaled. "Yeah, you remind me of someone." Ethan froze. Jason tilted his head. "You ever been told you look like Ethan Drake?" Ethan's heart stopped. This was it. He could lie. He could brush it off, or he could finally stop running. He met Jason's gaze. "That's because I am." Silence. Jason stared at him, his face shifting from confusion to shock to something colder. "You're joking," he said, voice hollow. Ethan shook his head. "I came undercover to see the truth for myself." Jason took a slow step back, his expression unreadable. And then Harriet and Talia appeared. They had just finished their final duties, but when they saw Ethan standing there talking to Jason, something clicked. Harriet's eyes narrowed. No way." Talia's face darkened. "You've got to be kidding me."
Ethan barely got a word in before Harriet stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You sat there and let us talk about you. You listened to everything we said, and you never said a damn thing?" Ethan held up a hand. "I needed to understand what was really happening. You what?" Harriet cut him off. "Needed proof that we weren't just complaining for fun." Talia crossed her arms. "And now what? You get to go back to your glass tower, throw some money at the problem, and call it a day?" Jason still hadn't spoken. He was just staring at Ethan with something close to betrayal. Ethan felt his stomach twist. They hated him. And for the first time, he knew he deserved it. The confrontation moved to the employee lounge inside the airport. The passengers were gone, and the crew was off duty. It was just Ethan, 3 furious flight attendants, and the weight of everything he had done wrong. Ethan had expected anger. He hadn't expected silence. Harriet was the first to speak. "You want to fix things? Fine, but we don't trust you." Ethan swallowed hard. "I understand, but I'm not here to just make a few changes and forget about it." Harriet scoffed. "Really? Because that's what every CEO does. They show up when the cameras are rolling, promise the world, and then disappear." Ethan clenched his jaw. "That's not who I am." "Then prove it," Jason said, his voice quiet but firm. Ethan turned to him. Jason had been the one to thank him earlier. But now? There was no gratitude in his eyes. "You think we don't know how this works?" Jason continued. "You'll go back to headquarters. You'll have a few meetings. You'll send an email about new policies that never actually change anything. And next week, we'll still be right here, dealing with entitled passengers and managers who only care about numbers." Ethan inhaled sharply. "I don't want to be that kind of leader." "Then, do something," Talia shot back. Harriet folded her arms. "Here's your first challenge, CEO. We have a meeting with management tomorrow morning about some of the worst policies we deal with. The kind of stuff they normally ignore. You want to prove you're serious?" Her eyes burned into him. "Sit in that room. Face the people who actually run your airline. And listen to what they say when they don't know you're there." Ethan hesitated. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew exactly what would happen. If he walked into that meeting, his own executives, the people he had trusted to run this airline, would expose just how broken everything was. And that would mean one thing. To fix this company, he would have to tear it apart first. The next morning, Ethan sat in the back of the Sunset Skies employee meeting room. He had arrived unannounced. No corporate security, no executive assistants. Just him. The managers at the table didn't even realize he was there. Harriet, Talia, and Jason sat across from them, alongside a few other crew members. And the moment the meeting began, Ethan saw everything that was wrong with his airline. Harriet brought up unfair promotions. A manager laughed. "We promote based on what's best for the company." Jason pointed out overworked schedules. A director rolled his eyes. "That's just the nature of the job." Talia mentioned abusive passengers. A senior VP shrugged. "Our priority is customer satisfaction. Employees just need to deal with it." Ethan sat there, boiling with anger. He had trusted these people, given them power. And in return, they had created a company where employees weren't people. They were disposable tools. Jason turned toward Ethan and murmured, "Still think an email's gonna fix this?" Ethan stood up. The entire room froze as they saw him. And for the first time since going undercover, he wasn't hiding anymore. Ethan placed his hands on the table, leaning forward. "We're done doing things your way," he said coldly. Silence. And then, the battle for Sunset Skies truly began. What happens next? Ethan has exposed the rot inside his own company. But will his executives fight back? Will they try to stop him from making real change? And most importantly, will his employees believe in him enough to fight alongside him? Stay tuned, because the next part of this story will be the most explosive yet. Would you fire the executives if you were Ethan? Or should he work with them? Let us know in the comments. Make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The boardroom was cold. Not physically, but in the way the air seemed heavy, filled with tension, distrust, and silent power plays. Ethan Drake sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the executives he had once trusted to run Sunset Skies Airlines. Today, they weren't his allies. They were his adversaries. Harriet, Talia, and Jason sat on one side of the room. Across from them were the company's senior managers, the ones who had laughed off employee concerns, dismissed complaints, and prioritized profits over people. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ethan leaned forward. His voice was calm but cold. "Let's be clear about why we're here." He slid a stack of papers across the table. Employee complaints. Evidence of unfair promotions. Instances of cabin crew being mistreated by entitled passengers while managers turned a blind eye. "This is what you've been hiding from me," he said. His gaze was sharp, unflinching. "And it ends today." One of the executives, a senior VP named Randall, scoffed. "Ethan, let's be realistic. You can't change everything overnight. Employees complain. That's just part of the job." Ethan's jaw tightened. "They're not complaining. They're begging us to treat them like human beings." Randall chuckled. "And what do you expect us to do? Give them all raises? Promote everyone who's unhappy? You're talking about profits, Ethan. We have shareholders to answer to." Ethan's voice was ice. "I built this company. I'm not going to let you destroy it." Randall leaned back, smirking. "You built it, sure. But we run it now." The room went silent. Ethan took a breath. His heart was pounding, but he refused to show it. He had made mistakes. He had been blind. But not anymore. He looked at Harriet, Talia, and Jason. They had trusted him enough to sit in this room with him. Now, it was his turn to earn that trust. "You're right," Ethan said quietly, looking directly at Randall. "I made this mess. I trusted people like you to take care of my employees, and I didn't check in. I didn't listen." Randall smirked, thinking he had won. But then Ethan's tone changed. "And that's why, effective immediately, you're fired." The smirk vanished. "What?" Randall's voice was sharp, panicked. "You can't do that." "I can," Ethan said, his voice steady. "And I just did. The room erupted in chaos. Executives protested, shouted, threw accusations, but Ethan didn't flinch. He turned to his assistant. "Prepare termination notices for anyone who has knowingly ignored employee complaints, and schedule an external audit of our promotion practices." Harriet's eyes widened. Talia covered her mouth, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Ethan wasn't making promises. He was taking action. 2 weeks later, Ethan stood on a stage in front of hundreds of Sunset Skies employees. The room was packed: pilots, flight attendants, ground staff. Some were skeptical. Others were hopeful. Ethan took a deep breath. This was the hardest speech of his life. "I made mistakes," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I trusted reports instead of people. I let a system grow that rewarded profits over fairness. And because of Ethan met her gaze. "Because I'm not just saying this. I've already fired the people who ignored you. We've launched an external review of our promotion process. And next month, we're increasing base pay for all flight attendants." There was a pause. Then Harriet nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. 6 months later, Ethan boarded a Sunset Skies flight. This time, he wasn't undercover. He wasn't hiding. He was Ethan Drake, CEO of Sunset Skies Airlines. As he walked down the aisle, he didn't see forced smiles. He saw real ones. Employees greeted him not out of fear, but because they wanted to. Near the galley, he saw Harriet and Talia. "Back again?" Harriet said, a small smirk on her face. Ethan smiled. Couldn't stay away. Talia crossed her arms, but there was a hint of warmth in her voice. "You actually did it, huh?" "I'm trying," Ethan replied. "Still a lot of work to do." Harriet nodded. "But at least now, we believe you." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. For the first time, he wasn't just the CEO of Sunset Skies. He was someone his employees could trust. The plane took off, and Ethan sat back in his seat. He wasn't perfect. He had made mistakes, but he had learned. And for the first time in a long time, he knew he was on the right path. Over the next year, Sunset Skies transformed. A new employee council was created, giving staff a voice in corporate decisions. External audits ensured fair promotions and eliminated bias. Pay increases and better working conditions improved morale. It wasn't easy. Change never is. But Ethan kept flying, kept listening, and kept fighting for his employees. Because leadership isn't about sitting in a glass tower. It's about being on the ground, with the people who make it all possible. This story isn't just about a CEO. It's about what happens when leaders listen. What do you think of Ethan's journey? Would you forgive him if you were in Harriet or Talia's shoes? Let us know in the comments. Make sure to hit subscribe for more incredible stories like this.